Hey everybody, it's Lance. Welcome back to another episode of Pastor's Bible Study. We're continuing in Mark's Gospel. We're in chapter 14, verse 66. So, just catching you up on what's happened, the clock has started ticking on the end of Jesus' earthly life and ministry. He's been arrested. He's been brought to trial. He's ultimately been condemned to death. And in just a moment here, the camera pans a little bit. It brings us over to something else that's taking place, and that's where we're going to pick up right now. In verse 66, it begins saying, "Meanwhile, Peter was below in the courtyard. A woman, one of the high priest's servants, approached and saw Peter warming himself by the fire. She stared at him and said, 'You were also with the Nazarene,'" Jesus, being called a Nazarene because he's from the area of Nazareth. But he denied it, saying, "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand what you're saying." And he went outside into the outer courtyard, and a rooster crowed. The female servant saw him and began a second time to say to those standing around, "This man is one of them." But he denied it again. A short time later, those standing around again said to Peter, "You must be one of them, because you are also a Galilean," referring to the region that he's from. But he cursed and swore, "I don't know this man you're talking about." At that very moment, a rooster crowed a second time. Peter remembered what Jesus told him, "Before a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down sobbing. So, just kind of getting a little bit of context of what's happening here. Jesus has been arrested. Soldiers came in and met him where he was praying in the middle of the night in a garden just outside the holy area of the city of Jerusalem. They've taken him in, they've put him on trial, they're beating him, and they're beginning the process of leading him to his execution. Meanwhile, those who follow Jesus, the disciples, these future apostles, people like Peter, are scattered. They're terrified, they're upset, they're vulnerable, they're worried, and they're particularly afraid that what is happening to Jesus might also happen to them. Now, it's important to remember that earlier in chapter 14, beginning in verse 27, one of the things that Jesus had let them know is, y'all are going to falter in your faithfulness to me. And Peter had said, "I won't. Even if everyone else does, I won't." And then Jesus tells him, "I assure you tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you absolutely will." So a couple things are important here. 1, we get an understanding of Jesus knowing what's going to happen. 2, we get a window into something that's still plaguing Peter, and that is his pridefulness. Even in the midst of following Jesus and listening to what he has to say and conforming his life to Jesus' pronouncements about the coming of God's kingdom, he still has this pride, this vainglory, that when Jesus says something's going to happen, he says, "Surely not to me. I would never succumb to that." Instead of hearing with humility, what Jesus is trying to teach him, instead he responds by saying, "Surely not me. No, never." And then what happens, right? Things actually get tough, things actually get scary, and Peter crumbles. So there's a couple different ways to look at this text. I think a really shallow way to look at it is just to look at Peter and say, we would never do that. I would never do that, right? Falling to that same trap of pride that Peter's fallen into. I think it's a lot more powerful to say, what does it say about all of us that this can happen in this moment? What's universal about humanity that creates moments where even despite all of our virtues and our commitments and our priorities, we falter? I want to stop right there. If you're watching independently, or if you're watching with the group, if you're listening on a podcast, I want you to pause and reflect on, have you seen others falter, right? When the chips are down and things get real, have you ever faltered? That may be a hard thing to admit to other people. Can you at least admit it to yourself? Can you at least admit it to Christ? And it's important that you do that, realizing that what happens next for Peter. And we don't get much of a window into it in Mark's gospel, so I'm just going to jump ahead and tell you, we have from other gospel accounts the knowledge of what happens in Peter's life. After the crucifixion, Peter leaves. He goes back to the area with which he's from. He goes back to fishing. He's literally gone home and given up. And it's there where the resurrected Christ meets him. Jesus meets Peter, and in doing so gives Peter a chance over a shared meal to affirm his faith in Christ 3 times. Just like Peter denied him 3 times, Peter gets the chance to undo that denial, to recommit himself, to make good on his commitments to Jesus. Not just because Jesus needs it or wants it, but because Peter needs the chance to do that. So what does it say about Jesus that Peter knows the kinds of failures that will take place in Peter's life. He knows the kind of failures that will take place in ours, even on the other side of making a commitment to be disciples, and yet he still doesn't give up on us. You know what happens with Peter after Jesus' resurrection and ascension. He goes on to be a saint. He establishes church after church after church. He goes on to be the first, what's now called Pope, a leader of the church in Rome. And so Peter is a perfect example of what Jesus is asking for is not perfection, but regular honesty and commitment and faithfulness. And it's a powerful reminder. One of the reasons why I find this to be one of the most powerful stories in the gospel. Okay, so as you paused and reflected on those things like forgiveness and reconciliation and the fact that Jesus knows our propensity to falter and to stumble and yet still picks us up, let's continue. At daybreak, chapter 15, verse 1, the chief priests, with the elders, legal experts, and the whole Sanhedrin formed a plan. They bound Jesus, led him away, and turned him over to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Okay, so I want to pause really quickly and make sure we understand all the characters that are taking place in this story. Up to this moment, the people who are angry at Jesus and conspiring against him are religious leaders and religious authorities. They're leaders of the Jewish practices of temple worship and the Jewish culture of right leading and right teaching, etc. And it's an incredibly important position. And they're upset with Jesus because of how Jesus is talking about himself. Remember, he uses the name I am, which is how God identifies God's self, just in last week's reading. He's also upsetting their apple cart of what authority means and what right belief means and what right teachings are. And so this is ultimately the reason why they want to get rid of him, silence him to the point of killing him. And yet they're kind of in a tough spot because their rules and obligations and customs don't allow them to just execute. Additionally, remember, Jerusalem, the nation of Israel, is currently under military occupation and control by the Roman Empire. So that kind of authority, who gets to live and who has to die, is a power that the Roman Empire reserves for itself. And the leader of the Roman Empire in that area, the person that's been appointed prelate or governor or administrator of that region, is Pontius Pilate. That's who we're talking about here. So Pilate is Roman. He's been dispatched here to supervise the area, and his job is pretty simple. He doesn't really care about the people of Israel. They're not his priority. He's certainly not trying to develop or build up their community. His job is to keep things quiet and to stop riots from breaking out, because riots are expensive. They create challenges for the Roman Empire. You have to send in troops and shut it all down, and that costs you a lot of money, not only in expense, but also in lost tax revenue. Taxes being a way to exploit wealth out of the community. And so Pilate's primary concern is just keeping stuff quiet, and the number one way to do that is to stop challenges from Rome's authority from rising up. Those are his priorities. He could not care less about internal Jewish struggles and difficulties and arguments over who has the right faith and who doesn't. He's certainly not Jewish. Couldn't care about any of that stuff. But what he does care about is relative peace, meaning no drama, and certainly no one threatening Rome's power and authority. That's the lens through which he's examining this story. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asks, meaning, are you someone who claims authority that would challenge Rome's authority in this area? Jesus replied, "That's what you say." The chief priests were accusing him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Aren't you going to answer? What about all these accusations?" But Jesus gave no more answers, so that Pilate marveled. So, just want to stop right here. One of the things that happens pretty regularly in their community and time and place is that people, good Jewish men and leaders, upset by the Roman occupiers, would begin to try to proclaim themselves as the leader of an uprising or a new rightful king of the Jews or something along those lines. And so Pilate asks him point blank, "Are you another one of these so-called anointed ones for the purposes of restoring this right rule to Israel?" And Jesus says, "That's what you're saying I am." And then he doesn't go on to plead for his life or plead innocence or try to make a righteous burn the house down speech to fire everybody else up. Instead, he's humble and steadfast and strong and silent in the midst of most of this interrogation. He's really calling the interrogation to answer for itself in this moment. And Pilate's marveling at that. That's not something that he expects to see. During the festival, verse 6, Pilate released one prisoner to them, whomever they requested. A man named Barabbas was locked up with the rebels who had committed murder during an uprising. The crowd pushed forward and asked Pilate to release someone, as he regularly did. Pilate answered them, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" He knew that the chief priests had handed him over because of jealousy, but the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas to them instead. Pilate replied, "Then what do you want me to do with the one you call king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Why? What wrong has he done?" They shouted even louder, "Crucify him." Pilate wanted to satisfy the crowd, so he released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus whipped, then handed him over to be crucified. Okay, so I want to stop right there. And a lot of times when this story is told, the focus is on Pilate and Pilate's conversations with the crowd, or it's focused on the idea of Barabbas, a murderer, being released instead. But I really want to view this story through the lens of the crowd, the people who are ultimately calling for Jesus to be killed. Because remember what happens just a few short days earlier. This is the culmination of what we call Holy Week. If you're a participant in the life of the church, there's this very special week, and it ends on Easter Sunday, the day of the resurrection, and it works backwards to Good Friday, the day of the crucifixion. There's Maundy Thursday before that. That's the day of the Last Supper. And then it begins with Palm Sunday. That's the beginning of Holy Week. And Palm Sunday is the story of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. And remember, people are cheering for him and celebrating him because they think he's come into Jerusalem as a conquering king, a person who's going to solve what they think is their most pressing issue, which is, we're occupied by these bad guys. They've taken over our territory. And this one, this anointed one, this Messiah, that's what Messiah means in Hebrew, he's going to be the one who delivers us back the Holy Land that we've been promised to God for our own stewardship and ownership and freedom. And then over the course of the next week, there in Jerusalem, Jesus begins to teach and to preach. He goes to the temple and condemns the ways in which they've corrupted the practices of right worship. He begins to proclaim not the coming of a new military kingdom in Jerusalem, but the coming of the kingdom of God. And he's not addressing what they think is their most urgent concern, the Romans, and instead he's addressing what he says is their most urgent concern, the reality for sin and the need for them to align their lives with God's coming kingdom. And guess what their reaction is? Frustration, disappointment, anger, to the point of, in just a few days, inside of 1 week, the people who were celebrating his coming by waving palm branches and throwing their cloaks on the ground in front of the animal upon which he was riding have now come to the point of saying, we just want him dead. Think about the frustration and the anger and the rejection that takes place in this moment. So part of my life as a Christian pastor, pastoring in a church and getting to speak to so many people, is I get a chance to hear firsthand and secondhand a lot of people's stories of rejecting Jesus. A lot of people have stories of rejecting Jesus in their life, and every story that I've heard is some version of this story. People wanted Jesus to be something for them. He wanted them to be maybe a person who provided a perfect direction in the midst of a certain moment, or a person who provided healing in a certain way and at a certain time, or a person who provided a certain feeling or a sign when they asked for it, something along those lines. Almost every story of rejecting Jesus is some version of, I wanted him to be this thing for me at this time, and he wasn't. And so I turned away from him. They might not have literally yelled crucify in their life, but ultimately that's what they're saying. I want nothing to do with him, which ultimately means I also want nothing to do with what God is doing through him. I want you to think about that, because that's where this story really comes home to roost. Not the historical fact that it happened one Friday in Jerusalem, but the current fact that it happens in the hearts and lives of people over and over again, even today. Ultimately saying, I want you to be this thing for me at this time, and if you're not, I reject you. So my question to you is, have you ever seen that play out? Has that ever occurred in your life or someone else's life? Has wanting Jesus to be a certain thing at a certain time, in a certain place, and in a certain way with a certain feeling, ever caused a crisis of faith for you or for anybody else? And the follow-up question to that is, okay, well, if he's not that certain thing at that certain time in that certain way, what is he? And if he's not solving that particular issue upon which I'm fixated and I think is the biggest problem in my life right now, what is he solving? What is he answering? What is he saying actually is your biggest need, and how is he answering it? This is where the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection is key in our own lives. And that's where I want to pause today. God bless y'all. Thanks for being a part of this Bible study. Can't wait to continue next time.